Hello, troublemakers. Welcome to this week's episode of Resolved Labor Podcast. I am your host, Lynn Fields, and this week we will be highlighting Rosina Carruthers Tucker. Rosina Carruthers Tucker was born November 4th, 1881. Shout out to the Scorpios. She was born in Northwest Washington, D.C. Her parents were Leroy and Henrietta Harvey, former slaves. Her father was a shoemaker who taught himself to read and write, and he impressed upon his love of reading and writing on all 9 of their children. In 1897, while visiting her aunt in Yonkers, New York, she met a cutie named James David Carruthers. James David Carruthers was born on July 2nd, 1869. Shout out to the Cancers. He was an African-American poet, journalist, and minister. He was born in Cass County, Michigan, a small anti-slavery activist town. He attended Northwest University in Chicago and Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina. He shared a long friendship with Paul Laurence Dunbar, and he served as a minister for African-American Methodist Episcopal, Baptist, and Presbyterian churches. He and Rosina traveled a lot because of his job. You know, he went from city to city opening up churches, and then she would teach music, write music, stuff like that to help out with the bills. They had one son, Henry Harvey. And on February 12th, 1917, David passed away of a stroke in Pennsylvania. So this brought Rosina back to Washington, D.C. after James's death. And in 1918, she met a man named Berthia J. Tucker, a Pullman porter, and they were married on November 27th, 1918. In 1925, Berthia and Rosina started hearing, murmurs about the Pullman porters wanting to form a union. And now you guys have to remember that, like we learned in the prior episode about A. Philip Randolph, the Pullman Porters was the largest employer of blacks in the United States at that time. And they were literally the, middle class. But working there, the working conditions were terrible because, the pay was good. However, the hours were really long, like 400 hours a month, and there was no grievance process. So in 1925, A. Philip Randolph came to D.C. because he had just co-founded the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in Harlem. And he was going from city to city, major hubs, trying to, form more chapters of the Sleeping Car Porters Brotherhood. So Rosina and, Berthia, they go to this meeting. And a lot of the Pullman porters, they were really apprehensive about this because, remember, if they were caught unionizing at this time, in those days, you could, just like today, you could just be fired. So, they came up with an idea that they would use, the women to organize the Pullman porters. Now, Rosina, she didn't work for the Pullman porters. There were women that did who worked there as like maids and attendants, but a lot of the wives, they didn't. So because the men were usually the ones that were really scrutinized when it comes to unionization, they were the ones being watched more closely. They came up with this idea that they would use the women to do the organizing. So Rosina decides, that she's going to help lead the efforts to, help unionize these porters in D.C. And she helps to create what was called a Women's Economic Council. And what they would do is they would throw parties and they would sell chicken plates and hold dances to, raise money for the union. And then, actually at their house, she would actually hold the meetings there in Washington. Like she remembers closing the curtains. All the women would come over like it was, book club night or something, some kind of secret code like that, right? And all the women would converge onto her house and they'd draw the curtains and then they would give out the information about the union and what was going on, give out all the literature, the updates. And then those women, they were to report that stuff back to their husbands. But, haters gonna hate. And of course, it got out that Rosina was spearheading, this effort. So, what the company did. They fired Berthia. So, word got out, that her husband was fired. And Rosina was like, oh, hell no. Like I know they didn't just fire you. So Rosina took it upon herself to go confront the supervisor. And these are her words. She says, I looked him right in the eye and banged on his desk and told him I was not employed by the Pullman Company and that my husband had nothing to do with any of my activity I was engaged in. I said, I want you to take care of this situation or I will be back. He must have been afraid because as black women did not speak to white men in this manner. My husband was put back on his run. That's right, Rosina. Rosina was like, don't be worrying about what's going on at 1128. Yeah, 1128 7th Street, Northeast, Washington, D.C. That's where they lived. So, yeah, Rosina, she put it down and her husband got his job back. So Rosina, she continued her organizing efforts after her husband got his job back. And in the end, she ended up visiting 300 porters. She distributed literature. She recruited members. She collected dues. And this is on top of organizing the dances and the parties and selling these chicken plates, right? So in 1935, the American Federation of Labor granted the porters a charter. And then 2 years later, the porters signed an agreement with the Pullman Company. And this agreement raised wages, decreased the hours, and instituted a grievance process.
Hey, this is Kim Reed from OEA Grow. We're proud to be part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network, with more than 200 labor radio shows and podcasts from across the country and around the world. The Labor Radio Podcast Network, where working people speak. Find us at laborradionetwork.org.
In 1938, the Pullman Porters held a national conference in Chicago, and Rosina chaired the Constitution and Rules Committee. That year, she was elected Secretary Treasurer of the now, instead of calling it the Women's Economic Council, they changed the name to the Ladies Auxiliary Order. And Rosina was elected the Secretary Treasurer. The formal creation of the order highlighted the role of the women in the union, but the recognition, it didn't go uncontested. So the men, they started challenging the authority and the organizing skills of, the leaders of the Ladies Auxiliary. Because that's what folks do, y'all. Like, y'all do all this work, y'all help them create, this thing, and then all of a sudden everything you did to lead up to the creation and make it come into fruition, now all of a sudden everybody want to question your methods. But haters is gonna hate. So these men, they're pissed off, they questioning Rosina's tactics, right? And they're like, basically keep selling this damn chicken, like we didn't ask you to do nothing else. But Rosina, she spoke out, right? So Rosina, she was adamant. She says, quote, Pullman porters' wives must be cognizant of the husband's working conditions. The porter's home has to be a union home. Without a union home, the porter could not be a good union man, end quote. So y'all know it wasn't, just the men that was bitching, right? It was also some of the other women that were, on the boards with her, right? They said that, Rosina was conducting herself more like a union woman and not a union wife, which I guess I'm reading the distinction would be a union woman would be a worker, and then a union wife would be like on the sidelines, like cheering on the union husband who was doing the work. So like they were like trying to differentiate and, calling her unladylike. But Rosina, again, she defended herself. She said, quote, I think it is very ladylike to belong to a union. And the next best thing to it is to belong to a union man, end quote. So Rosina, like, she did not mince words. Like, it's like, I said what I said. Rosina held the position of Secretary Treasurer in that union for 30 years. She lobbied for labor and education legislation. She testified before the House and Senate subcommittees on daycare, education, labor, and voting rights. She helped to organize laundry workers, teachers, porters, like you name it. Rosina had her name in it. And at 102 years old, she testified at a Senate subcommittee on aging. So it's like, if it's affecting my life, I'm talking about it. And at 104, she was still traveling and giving lectures. On March 3rd, 1987, at the age of 105, Rosina Carruthers Tucker passed away. She wrote a book about her life called My Life as I Have Lived It. It was published posthumously in 2012. And that house, troublemakers, that house at 1128 7th Street Northeast in Washington, D.C., it's actually still standing, and I believe it is a historical landmark. Back in 89, somebody bought it for $85,000. But if you've got an extra $670,649 laying around, you can get this 2-bed, 1-bath, 1,300 square foot home. And yeah, yay for interest rates. And that, troublemakers, is our short story of Rosina Carruthers Tucker. You know, Rosina did a lot more stuff. Like, she actually was she helped to organize, the March on Washington with Martin Luther King and A. Philip Randolph. But, as you guys know, like, I usually just try to stick to the union side of, the folks that we are highlighting. But I just really wanted to just throw that nugget out there because she was just so much more. And I implore you to, just read up more on this amazing, amazing woman. And now comes the time in the show where we give our flowers. And this week, I would like to give my flowers to Alyssa Goldstein. Alyssa Goldstein is the communications director for the Illinois AFL-CIO. She is a Chicago girl. She lives out in Chicago and she works between Chicago and Springfield. And she writes these wonderful articles and she keeps, the union masses like up to date on everything that's going on in union land. She helps organize these amazing trainings, for activists that, things that like folks wouldn't even think of to have trainings on. She organizes these great Zoom meetings, and she is really just giving the AFL-CIO in Illinois like a real jolt and a real shot in the arm, like keeping them abreast and like keeping them feeling new and fresh and engaged. And I just want to give my flowers to Alyssa because you are doing amazing work, girl. And I really, really hope that you are around for a long time. And they are lucky to have you. And we are lucky that you are on our side. Keep up the good work. And if you would like to give flowers to someone in your community, someone in your local, because as you know, we do not wait for someone to pass away. We do not wait till they are no longer with us for us to tell them how much we appreciate them. Please write to us. Please write to us at resolvedlaborpod@gmail.com. That is resolvedlaborpod@gmail.com. And we would be honored to read one of your letters on a future episode. Don't forget to rate us, share us, follow us, review us, all the things us. And if you don't like us, then just tell somebody you don't like and waste their time. Thanks again for listening, troublemakers. As always, peace and solidarity. This week's episode of Resolved Labor Podcast is produced by The Create Place Studio. You can find them on all social media platforms at The Create Place STL. We Won is performed by Joe Jinks and written by John O'Connor. This has been Resolved Labor Podcast. As always, peace and solidarity.
Everybody come and join in the union. Begin. Stand together to overcome soon, and we win.